A warm welcome to all of you, and I'm delighted to introduce to you Pankaj Gupta. He's a practicing architect and a good friend whose contributions in way of suggestions and advice to our Porsche platform actually cannot be overstated. Pankaj is a graduate of Yale University and the University of Virginia, and he's the co-founder of Veer Mueller Architects that he runs with his partner Christine Mueller. The practice has been the recipient of several awards, including um, the awards from the American Institute of Architects, the Foundation for World Education, the George Nakashima Foundation for Peace, and the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, amongst others. They have recently completed the Humayun's Tomb Site Museum for the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, and it's India's first contemporary museum on a World Heritage Site. Pankaj is also Professor of Architecture at the University of Virginia and co-founder and co-director of the Yamuna River Project. It's a long-term interdisciplinary research program whose ambitious objective is to revitalize the ecology of the Yamuna River in the mega city of New Delhi. Part of the ongoing work has been distilled into a book a few years back, and I'm fortunate to have a copy of it, and it represents a substantial and an exceptional body of work. I'm sure Pankaj will touch upon the many challenges they've faced undertaking this work, but the learnings from this are particularly important for our own studio. His talk follows a series of talks looking at water and the river, and his might be a very different perspective from the other talks, and I hope one that will lead us from the river to a notion of the commons. If I may read out a few lines from his book, and I quote, Delhi's citizens are now completely detached from their river, only part of a larger detachment from the formerly shared consciousness of public space, and in fact, from the concept of the commons. This detachment is the underlying cause of Delhi's environmental dilemma. The Yamuna River, perceived as an incarnate goddess, is incapable of supporting physical life. Please join me in welcoming Pankaj Gupta.
Okay, so let me just do full screen. Okay, you can see it?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much for having me on this series of talks. It's a real privilege. I've been long an admirer of the kind of intellectual heft that Riaz and you have brought to our profession and our circle of colleagues. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity to give a little bit back in a sense. Thank you for that generous introduction. So I won't dwell anymore on the other hats I wear, but I'll dive straight into this particular project and the history of this project. In 2012, I was invited by the University of Virginia to teach for one semester as the Shore Visiting Chair. It's a chaired professorship in architecture. And at that point, I was asked to bring a dilemma with me that I wanted to explore with an advanced design studio. For those of you who may not be familiar, the way many US advanced studios work in architecture schools there is that there's a mix of students, both undergrad and grad, also from architecture and landscape. So it was a really interesting kind of opportunity to work over the course of a semester with about 13 or 14 students and explore something. This was also around the time that I was working very closely with probably one of India's greatest landscape architects, Professor Shahir, who is unfortunately no more. And we had started working on the Humayun's Tomb Museum Commission. We had previously been working on the Ahmedabad University building project together. He was the landscape architect for our building. And we had started these series of conversations about the presence of architecture, the presence of public space. And in that set of conversations, the idea started to emerge in my mind that really these were trivialities, because what we were not talking about was the elephant in the room, which was the ecological construct of our cities, the fact that our cities happened to be where they were located because of forces that were geographic or climatic or natural resource laden in nature. And that's where the conversation needed to shift. Interestingly, when I proposed to Shahir that this was the studio I was going to teach, he was aghast. He said, "Listen, there are some things that are best left untouched." But I think this is also where I would give a lot of credit to the American academic system, because ironically, when I was a professor at SPA, I proposed the very same topic at SPA, and the department head shot it down. But I had a very supportive chair, Iñaki Alday, who himself is a very renowned landscape architect. He's done a lot of work in Spain on ecological restoration of urban rivers. Their project in Saragossa, which is the Aranzazi Water Park, is one of the great landscape projects of river restoration in an urban environment. I encourage all of you to look that up. So Iñaki offered to actually co-teach this studio with me. He had never been to India. He had never heard the word Yamuna before. And that's the kind of prehistory of the project. And so we started at the very beginning. Can you guys see the screen? Can you see the images?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So we basically wanted to have a really unbiased and clear-eyed look at what had happened in the centuries preceding our current urban and ecological construct for the Yamuna in Delhi. And so we started looking at archival images. We started looking at the presence of architectural artifacts in painting, in lithographs, in drawing, in early photographs, and really tried to understand how this plain, how the terrain of Delhi was initially inhabited and slowly transformed into its current incarnation as a mega city. So we looked at these sites. This is the Purana Killa in 4 different visions. You can see Humayun's tomb in one of the images in the distance, one from 1814. So we started looking at the floodplain and the treatment of the floodplain. We really were struck by how even in that tenuous moment where the Mughal city of Shah Jahanabad was uneasily coexisting with the British imperial kind of the beginnings of the British imperial occupation, and especially leading up to the mutiny in 1857, when the entire walled city was essentially forcibly evacuated and resettled with large-scale demolitions. Even up to that pivotal moment, you see in this etching the historic relationship of the urbanity and the ecology could not be more directly addressed than it is here. The Yamuna was not just the transportation highway, the kind of font of agricultural produce, but it was really a very important aesthetic presence. And Shamsur Rahman Farooqi in his book writes in The Mirror of Beauty, he says the Yamuna was the mirror of the city, both literally and figuratively. It framed the idea of self. It also framed an idea of ecology as being integral to the aesthetic sophistication of this imperial city. All that was soon to change. And, I'm fast forwarding very quickly to where we were in 2014. This is an article from the New Yorker and from the Outlook, where, obviously, politicians need big ticket selling points. And one of the big ticket selling points for this particular government became this massive challenge and addressing this. But actually, since we had started looking in 2012, this massive challenge is not an easy beast to wrestle to the ground. And so what we realized we would have to do, rather than being singular as academics or as architects or as landscape architects, we would need to really frame a much broader series of conversations and perspectives to understand where we had come and how we were going to get out of where we were at, which is a very precarious ecological situation. So you can see from these satellite images, Google Earth has been transformative in the way many of us understand our own cities. And looking at this set of images, you can see that the one on the left is actually from 1998, and the one on the right is from 2008. And so you can see, even in a 10-year span, that the identity of the national capital region, which was this kind of region ringed by the Aravalis, by a kind of hinterland of agriculture and scrub forest, and bisected by the ecological flow of the Yamuna, was essentially decimated. And even by the turn of the century or the dawn of this millennium, the urbanization paradigms of Delhi had kind of obliterated the last vestiges of the notion of a forest encircled urban capital. Starting in 2012, about 14 to 15 students and faculty from the University of Virginia began annual trips to Delhi. And these were not the typical, let's go visit a site, have some food, have some nice days, and then go back and design a project. These were really serious 10, 12, 15-day excursions. The faculty team typically comprised of environmental scientists, public health experts, faculty from the Darden School of Business who looked at the economics of ecological restoration, obviously Iñaki and myself as the lead faculty of the studio. And then, like I said, students from landscape, students from urban design and architecture. And we began looking at the condition of the Yamuna by walking stretches north of the Wazirabad barrage, which is where the Yamuna enters New Delhi, and walking south of the Okhla barrage, 25, 28 kilometers later, where it leaves the city of Delhi. And this is a scene, this photograph is taken literally just about a half a kilometer south of the Wazirabad barrage. This is the river as it has entered the city. And you don't see a river. And by that, I mean, the first thing that struck us when we were on these early years of our site visits was that there were no birds on the Yamuna. You couldn't hear any avian life. You couldn't obviously see any aquatic life. And especially for my students and for my fellow faculty members who were all European or American, this was bewildering. How can you have a vast expanse of water and literally not attract a bird? And those were some of the early shocking kind of moments when we realized that this was actually not water. There is no dissolved oxygen in this water capable of sustaining any life. So this is just sewage. So what we actually call the Yamuna in Delhi is essentially sewer and pollutant and toxic effluent runoff. There is no water capable of sustaining any organic life. We also looked at the physicality of these sites very carefully. And again, I go back to this etching from Montgomery in 1860. Robert Montgomery Martin was one of the early chroniclers of the kind of urban artifacts of the empire during the colonial rule of the British. And again, you see on the left the banks of Shahjahanabad, almost kind of in a picaresque rendering with the river. You see the aggregate. So the east bank, where you see the kind of few figures, was the low-lying bank. And so that was likely to be more intensively inundated during the annual monsoon floods. Whereas the right bank, the west bank, so to speak, was where Shah Jahan had obviously built the imperial capital. And actually, the tower that you see in the foreground is the tower that marks the entrance of the freshwater canal. So interestingly, Shah Jahan's urban planners were not drawing water from the river for drinking right in front of the palace. There was a separate rivulet that was being drawn from the Himalayas, from Yamunotri, from where now actually the closest major landmark now is the Hathni Kund barrage. And so that fresh water was exclusively for the drinking water. It was the Delhi Jal Board of its time. And in another kind of revelatory decision, that water inlet into the walled city provided drinking water to every single home before it actually arrived at the imperial palace. So this is a really interesting for us point, that even in the imperial Mughal regime, the idea that the river and the drinking water would first be this egalitarian distributed network to every individual home before the emperor himself would taste it, meant that at every single point it was pristine. it was pure, it was clean, it was unsullied. Today, the site, the photograph on the right shows you pretty much exactly the same site, where what we have found in, this is now our ninth year of walking these banks, of studying this dilemma, of trying to understand and distill a kind of not just set of analyses, but now proposing methodologies for remediation. What we realized is that all of this kind of West Bank was unbuildable in its present circumstance, because of the last 30, 40, 50 years, every conceivable non-public interface has been layered on this territory. And by non-public interface, I mean things like dumping of coal ash from the power plant that you see in the distance, the actual locating of the power plant on the floodplain, locating a solid waste treatment plant on the floodplain, putting metro depots and bus parking lots, essentially taking what in Montgomery Martin's etching is the kind of, you know, refuge, the ecological refuge from the city, and turning into the infrastructural dump yard of the city. And this is important to see, because to realize, because this changes your consciousness of the potential of this river and its interface with the city. This is you know, one of the faculty colleagues who's been amazing to work with is Professor Matthew Reidenbach. He was trained at Stanford in geospatial analysis, and for the last 12 years at the University of Virginia has set up the Geospatial Mapping Laboratory. They help NASA and the National Oceanic Atmospheric Research organizations to really infer and analyze data that is taken from satellite imagery. And, you know, at every given point of time, a satellite is taking an image of every spot on Earth every 7 seconds. That's a huge amount of visual information. Very few of us know, but that information, when it's collated and assembled and analyzed over a long duration, can give you very revealing facts of about a particular territory you may be interested in studying. In this case, we zoomed in. Professor Reidenbach showed us this image. And he had, when he took this image, he had not yet made his first trip to Delhi. And he said, "What the hell is that?" So what you see in this image, if I can show you, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that is the Hathni Kund Barrage. Can you see my cursor? Anyone? Sudipto, is it possible?
Yes, we can see it, yes.
So that's where a largely unpolluted Yamuna River is entering the National Capital Territory of New Delhi. And you can see from the color of the water there, yes, there are little contaminants here and there from some agricultural, you know, fertilizer runoff or effluent. But even up to this point, there are, you know, if you go today, especially during the monsoon, you are likely to spot a very prolific range of bird life and aquatic life. I have seen a river dolphin about 2.5 kilometers north of this barrage. So this is still largely what we would call potable water. It needs very little treatment. And so it's no accident that at the point where the Wazirabad barrage was constructed, all three of the water treatment plants that supply Delhi's drinking water are all located within a kilometer radius of each other. Now, this was an interesting infrastructural decision. For us, it was, you know, obviously it makes sense that you would have your water treatment plant right where the river enters your city. But it's also, you know, really loading all your eggs in a single basket. God forbid that there's a huge ammonia influx, which often happens when the, you know, during the monsoons, because they know the water is more dilute, a lot of the upstream farmers will release effluent into the river thinking they'll escape, you know, detection. And in those days, we get what are called these ammonia spikes. And then the water is not capable of being treated to potable quality by the Jal Board infrastructure. So nonetheless, what we realized was that this was actually a vulnerability to concentrate all of the water treatment plant infrastructure, whether it's coming from the Ganga Canal, from the Bhagirathi, or from the Sonia Vihar water treatment plant, or the Wazirabad plant in this location. This is the zone where we were really starting to be perplexed about what was going on. What you see here, this is the last 4 or 5 or 8 or 10 kilometers of what is called the Najafgarh Drain. The Najafgarh Drain about 60 or 70 years ago was not the Najafgarh Drain. It used to be called the Sahibi River. And this was a perennial river. It was a spring-fed and a monsoon seasonal water-fed river that drained into the Yamuna and drained largely clean water. But over its 58-kilometer length, and I'll show you as we move forward in the presentation, the Najafgarh drain, or the Sahibi River, as it was called earlier, had no idea that its origin site would become the largest new development outside of Delhi, which is today known as Gurgaon. And over the years, this drain, this single drain, drains 70% of the entire contamination of the river Yamuna. And by which I mean, if you were to take water samples from Yamunotri all the way to Sangam in Allahabad, 70% of the entire pollution of the entire length of the Yamuna River is coming at this one point. This was shocking to us, and we just couldn't understand how, for decades, after spending thousands of crores of rupees on water remediation and treatment, not a single municipal agency and not a single political leader had spent any effort or articulated any intellectual or technical propositions for how this point would be obliterated, this source of effluent would be remediated. So basically, what we in Delhi inhabit is the effluent of the Najafgarh drain. 100% of the Yamuna north of Wazirabad is trapped here. And actually, this water, and the fact that other than the few trickles or in the monsoon a few overflows, none of the water coming from the Himalayas is actually reaching, say, this point in the river. It's all stopped at that barrage. And then what happens is also interesting, because very little technical and upgradation discussion has taken place. We are still supplying all of this water that's treated at the barrage in these water treatment plants in essentially a pipe network that in places is over 50, 60, 70 years old. And so what we have is a water loss of almost 50%. So this is important. I'm stressing this. I know maybe some of you as architects may think this is extraneous to your real talents, but it's important to note that actually when we complain in Delhi of water shortages and we complain in Delhi of not being able to sustain our populace, we never really articulate fully that we are actually squandering 50% of the drinking water that is being trapped for treatment and distribution. The other thing that's really interesting is because of the toxicity of the Najafgarh drain, because of this particular flow, any clean water from the monsoon or from the seasonal runoffs during the months of July, August, and September is instantly contaminated because it comes into contact with water that is toxic. And the final piece of this, which is also equally damning, is the entire series of nalas and seasonal rivulets that fed the Yamuna from the monsoon rain have now essentially become solid waste dumping grounds, which means that by our, when we started analyzing and measuring and doing soil tests, that up to 6, 8, 10 meters in certain cases of these nalas is essentially sludge, septage, and solid waste that has been dumped over the previous several decades, which means that any clean water coming into contact with this surface of you see them in red in this diagram, these are all these kind of historic seasonal perennial nalas, or summer seasonal, summer perennial, I'm sorry. These are all now repositories of so much solid waste and septage that clean water cannot percolate into the aquifers. Clean water cannot go down and recharge the kind of floodplain or the aquifers of Delhi. This diagram on the left that we prepared many years ago, we really started collaborating closely with the Delhi Jal Board, with a very progressive CEO at the time, an IAS officer named Keshav Chandra, and he started sharing with us what the sewage treatment capacities in various parts of the city really were. And as architects, again, we found this really interesting because we were trying to derive a relationship or a kind of correlation between the sewage treatment or the solid waste treatment capacity and the population of that area. This is a view of the site. This photograph was taken about 5 years ago. One of my friends and colleagues, who's an architectural photographer, also an architect in Delhi, Randhir Singh, accompanied us to document it, to create a photo essay of our work. And this is actually the origin site of the Sahibi River. And beyond these trees and beyond, there you see the first of the Gurgaon high rises. And I remember this site as a child because, from my grandfather, I had heard stories that, in the 60s, late 50s and 60s, these were the kind of duck hunting grounds of Delhi. And this is when, literally hundreds of thousands of fowl would come and breed here. This was a kind of breeding ground for waterfowl. And so this was a kind of wetland area, also, where the origin of the Sahibi River really was, because all of this, the ground functioned as a soak. And when you look at this photograph, you imagine you're standing in almost this like serene, beautiful kind of picnic site. But actually, it was impossible to stand there for more than 10 minutes. I mean, we had to have our mouths covered with masks and scarves because the effluent and the kind of malodor that was coming off this was absolutely unbearable. The stench was unbearable because there is no water here now. It's literally just all raw sewage. So yes, you see all of this green, but these are basically the kind of lowest level of plants that can survive with this toxic water. This is another drain that we photographed. This is Taimur Nagar. This is actually very close to the Yamuna floodplain near the neighborhoods of Jamia Nagar and Firenze Colony, Maharani Bagh, that area of Delhi. And again, we spent a lot of time in these neighborhoods, and you can see the disjunct. You see the kind of slum settlements on the one side. You see the drinking water supply lines and the sewage treatment supply lines right laid bare. You see what were seasonal rivulets, and you see people who are building and living on one side of this nala. They are driving cars, they have air conditioners, and this is where they throw their garbage. And as we saw, we kind of spent the whole day just watching, and we started talking to the residents. And essentially we learned that because these are quote unquote unauthorized colonies, there is no real organized solid waste management or garbage pickup service. So all of these residents throw all of their waste into this nala. And every 2 weeks, the irrigation and flood control department of the government, which is also now subsumed under the Delhi Jal Board, will send a dredger or a bulldozer that will just push all of this waste into the river. And this happens every fortnight. And then you can see that whether you're living on this side or you're living on this side, all your untreated effluent right there is just flowing into this nala. So we realized, I mean, by year 3 or 4, Iñaki and I, with the support of the university leadership, realized that the thing that we had to do was make all this information really transparent and really accessible and available to anyone in the public domain. This is long before our book was published. So we set up a pretty comprehensive website, which is still active, the yamunariverproject.org. And we literally started uploading any and all of our research. Obviously, we would format it, we would clean it up in the sense of, drawing it precisely, etc. But we realized that the first thing we needed to do was to launch a campaign of greater public awareness of the issues. And that was, driven by two large kind of learnings. And I would credit Iñaki with this because he said, Pankaj, in Barcelona and in Spain in general, which is also a water scarce country, the first step in urban remediation, especially of the water resource management principles and projects, came with garnering over a very long period of time, massive public support and belief in the project. It's almost like convincing an entire nation that you need a vaccine for, BCG or for polio. So we realized that even us as architects, as citizens, I live in Delhi, many of the people I speak with are oblivious of the dilemmas of the Yamuna. Everyone can parrot that line, oh, the Yamuna is dirty. But nobody really can go much further than that. Nobody really understands what the causes are and what the paradigms for remediation could be, because it's just not, that information is not shared, and the Yamuna itself is not a visible entity for most of the people living in Delhi. The other thing that we did, we realized that we were incapable. Our training as architects and as educators or even academics is very limited. So we really reached out wide, and we, not just with fellow kind of academics at the University of Virginia, but we started going to meet every single person we could think of. If anyone would give us 10 minutes of their time, whether they were the Minister for Water Resources for the Government of India, or it was the head of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, or it was a small NGO working in Batla House, with educating school kids on the floodplain, we would meet everyone. We would share our project information with everyone. We appointed an advisory board comprising of academics and eminent policy planning experts at the university, just to help us frame this argument. And I cannot emphasize this enough, because as architects, we often look at contour plans and site plans and forest cover, etc. But there are cultural and social perspectives that really are equally, if not more important. For instance, we created what I believe is the first graphic iteration of the complexity of the Yamuna's governance. And this was, we partnered with my friend and colleague, John Echeverry Gent, who's a long-term India scholar and professor of politics at the University of Virginia. And he started explaining and unraveling how various little portions of the Yamuna were governed, whether it was a nala, whether it was a tributary, whether it was the embankments, whether it was the actual barrage itself. And at the very least, there are 27 different agencies that exercise some level of control, whether it's funding control or governance control or restrictive authority in some way. And it was remarkable because we worked with him to create this graphic. And when we shared this graphic with then Water Minister Uma Bharti, and then following her, Mr. Gadkari, with the LG. And the LG, by the way, the current LG of Delhi 20 years ago had served as the Secretary for Urban Development. So he's someone who actually knows how urban governance ought to work. And literally the reaction was shock and awe. And this was kind of new to us. Nobody, even the people who are governing our city, governing our country, aren't actually aware sometimes of the complications of their own governance structure. Or if they are, they might be aware of just these few agencies or these few agencies, depending on where they sit. But when they realized and they were shown this research in this way, it became really clear that it would be impossible to begin any serious river remediation project. I'm actually happy to say, I'm jumping forward again, this was made in 2014. Now we are in 2020. But because of this diagram, a copy of which sits on most of the offices of the senior level of governance administrators in Delhi, many of these agencies have been consolidated. So for instance, the water minister of Delhi now, Satyendra Jain, single-handedly controls all these 5 or 6 agencies now. These have been consolidated. Because of this diagram, irrigation and flood control was brought under the ambit of the Delhi Jal Board, which was then brought under the ambit of the Delhi water minister. So there have been, I think success is a kind of relative term, but I think I just want to share that because of some of our research and some of our graphic articulation, change has taken place for the positive. We worked very closely with the Delhi Jal Board to develop a kind of alternative structure for how the river and the territory of the river might be organized by the government. In other words, helping them be more streamlined and also more accountable to themselves in the way they would, rethink their management of the river and its interface with the city. Another wonderful participant in our study over many years has been Professor Dan Anbaum. He actually was one of my professors for South Asian art history when I was an undergraduate at the University of Virginia. And he started showing us these extraordinary pieces of art and sculpture that depicted the Yamuna. Here you see the Yamuna shown as the turtle, the goddess. Yamuna goddess is shown on the turtle is actually the emblem of the river. And he gave a very impassioned set of directives. And he said, listen, if you've removed the cultural antecedents and the ritual and the religious and the the kind of civilizational antecedents of the river from the citizens of the city today, then you are talking to them about an infrastructural upgrade. But what you actually could be doing simultaneous with that is upgrading their own sense of anchor within this civilization umbrella. And I think that was really a remarkable realization, that what very little attention is paid to the other offshoots that have emerged, that are really vital to our own sense of identity and our own sense of history over thousands of years, from the presence of these entities, not just from them being venerated as a turtle here or here as a river goddess, but also this whole line of aesthetic practices that emerged from this. We also worked very closely with Winston Lung. He's a professor of environmental engineering at the University of Virginia. And his great expertise lay in the restoration of the Chesapeake Bay waterfront in the US. For those of you who may not be familiar, this is a kind of area where around the capital of the US, around Washington, DC and Baltimore, this was one of the most contaminated interfaces between urban life on these eastern shore cities and the Atlantic Ocean. And so Winston Lung was one of the team of 8 or 10 kind of environmental engineering experts who in the late 70s and throughout the 80s really were instrumental in creating this empirical approach, saying we have to measure, we have to quantify how much waste are we generating, how contaminated is the water, what population in a city can be sustained with what degree of treatment, etc. And so he really understood very large scale urban remediation. It was kind of sort of in his genetic professional code. And he started making kind of 3 or 4 trips a year with us to India, and started independently taking water samples. So you see here, these are all the drains: Magazine Road, Sweeper Colony, Khyber Pass, Metcalf House, Qudsiya Bagh. These are all the various seasonal rivulets previously, now stormwater and sewage drains, where the stormwater from the monsoon is inextricably mixed with the raw solid waste and sewage, and then flows into the Yamuna. And he started quantifying what the dissolved oxygen loads really were. So, you want a healthy BOD level of is about 5 milligrams per liter. And that's what the Yamuna has. It's close to 5 milligrams per liter right before it enters Wazirabad. But by the time it leaves at Okla, there is no dissolved oxygen in the water. But more importantly, what Winston started discovering is that the toxicity levels by the time the Yamuna left Delhi and Okla was so high that there were no remediation protocols. In other words, that you were essentially dealing with an industry. The entire river was an industrial effluent. And so the cost and the infrastructure of treating it at that point was essentially non-existent in the developed world. With Matt Reidenbach, who I mentioned earlier, we started putting out, this is in our book on the website, another kind of set of diagrams and graphics. Remember, I shared with you the idea that these satellite images were being mapped on a very regular basis and, depicting the kind of urban ecological advancement, evolution, or regression, if you will, of the city. So you can see in 1991, this is Delhi. Everything in red is actually really good. I know it's a kind of color flip, but what is shown in red is the forest cover or the green cover. So in 1991, with a population of about 10 million people, this is the Yamuna. So you see that the kind of embrace of the forest of the Aravalis to the west, and the kind of general agricultural belt and the rural belt in Uttar Pradesh to the east, the north, there is a fair amount of green cover, which then is trickling down through the Yamuna floodplain and then continues south of Okla. And here's the situation, basically 20 years later. And you see that now the population has doubled, but essentially we have completely exterminated most of the green cover around, which is and by the green cover, I don't mean just like, aesthetically, it's nice to look at trees. I mean that these are the soaks. These are the areas, the large acreages and square kilometers of the city where monsoon water is allowed to recharge, percolate, flow into the aquifers, and sustain, the kind of organic environmental quality of life that you want in a city. And you can realize that, you can see in these two comparisons with With a doubling of the population, the kind of decimation of the ecological cover is absolute. More alarmingly, what Matt Reidenbach pointed out is that if this rate of advancement, and more importantly, if this paradigm of advancement continues, that by 2028, there will be no groundwater extractable from the national capital region, and the capacity of this region to absorb surface water from the monsoon is zero, which actually means, I mean, as perverse as it sounds, that it would be cheaper to use diesel in trucks to supply water to the entire city by burning gasoline. I mean, it's an alarming thing to realize, but he has done this for hundreds of cities globally, and this is not. And so, for those of you who are interested in Central Vista, by the way, this is the Central Vista area, which is the kind of greenest part of area of Delhi, but this is less than 4% of the population. I'm saying the larger kind of central area. So Matt's conclusions were inescapable. There would have to be a serious program of reforestation or ecological remediation for the groundwater imbalance to start to be sustainable. We also, much of the information that we were looking at and researching in the early years of our project was in the public domain. So these are actually maps that we received from the Department of Irrigation and Flood Control. These are the flood level maps, 10-year floods, 20-year floods, 50-year floods, 100-year floods. This one, the largest one on the left, is the 100-year flood map. Now, it was interesting that when we met with the officers in the DDA, the Delhi Development Authority, people who are in charge of planning processes, they had never seen these drawings, or very few of them had, or if they had, they pretended they were irrelevant. But these are not irrelevant drawings. This synergy of informations across departments is really cannot be emphasized enough as being critical if you're going to plan a city. What this large drawing, this is the 100-year flood mark for the city. And by the way, because all of you are scholars and you know that climate change has resulted in the 100-year flood marks being essentially becoming 25-year flood marks. That means when, if there was a flood that may have occurred once in 100 years, or the chance of that flood occurring any given year was 1%, because of climate change, that number, that risk has exponentially grown 4 times. So essentially what would have been considered a 100-year flood kind of ratio of probability is now a 25-year flood. So essentially, if we have a 25-year flood, over 3.5 million people in Delhi will be completely inundated. And that means under 2 meters of water, which means neighborhoods, infrastructure, Commonwealth Games Village, metro yards. So this is also something that we couldn't understand as researchers, why there was not a more vociferous and robust kind of critical examination or debate on the growth paradigms that are being adopted by the city. Because and this is something that had befuddled the British. Their treatment of their rivers was governed by a single principle. Those were all glacial rivers. There's no such thing as a monsoon in most of Europe. Whereas in India, the Yamuna is likely to, in Delhi, almost triple, if not quadruple, its floodplain expanse during the monsoons. Now, by embanking these banks, by fortifying them with infrastructure and walls, is not a solution to a river that is not entirely glacial, that is fed by the monsoon. We also started looking at what the water quality in Delhi, how the water quality in Delhi was affected by the landfills in Delhi. And so for those of you who live in Delhi, there are 3 major landfills: Bhalswa, Ghazipur, and Okhla. You know that these landfills are vastly now over their capacity. In fact, if you drive, say, towards Tughlakabad and you see the Okhla landfill, it looks like a mountain. It's like a landscape feature, actually. If you're driving north towards Sonipat and you see the Bhalswa landfill, which often is on fire, it's smoldering most of the time. That is like you might be forgiven for mistaking it as an outcrop of the Aravalli Hills. The problem is that because of those overcapacities, we have basically started a kind of quasi-officially sanctioned dumping of waste in any other site that is considered appropriate, without all of the infrastructural and ecological safeguards that need to be in place. So our map shows that there are actually now waste disposal sites in scattered all across the territory of the national capital region. We also looked, I know this is all sounding really grim probably and miserable, and you're like, what the hell is he saying? But then we felt it was important to actually, for those in India who may not be aware, say that, most cities in Europe were really in a very similar predicament less than 100 years ago, 50, 70, 60 years ago. This is Barcelona. And Barcelona in Spain was called Trashalona in the 50s and 60s because this entire beachfront, which this is the Mediterranean, was all littered with industry, waste, fertilizer, and basically these were the slums of the city. And there was no access to the sea. This was the major harbor and the port where the ships would come in. And in a remarkable turnaround, I'm skipping over all of this because of time, but a very enlightened mayor who was trained as an architect, hiring a lot of urban planners, really, using the fulcrum of the Barcelona Olympics in 1992, leveraging a lot of state funds and loan funding, started to restore the relationship of the city with the sea. And this is what now you see. If you go to Barcelona, and it's probably one of the most touristed cities in Europe now, but even for long-term residents of Barcelona, like Iñaki and his wife partner Margarita, this has been transformational. This is a public amenity that is available to every citizen of this democracy. This was our learning, that essentially, if we were to create a vision for the restoration of the Yamuna, for the revitalization of the ecology of our capital city, that this vision would have to be presented as a totally egalitarian ecological vision, using the Najafgarh Drain, this 58-kilometer east-west spine, using the Wazirabad to Okhla 25-kilometer north-south stretch of the Yamuna, using the Aravalis as the kind of armature, and saying that the only vision of the city, and I'm not talking about the architecture of a particular building or a site or even the central vista, I'm saying that first, everything would have to be framed in terms of its accountability or favorability to a larger vision of this region as this kind of harmonized forest and river floodplain water recharge system network. I'll jump a little bit forward now to how we moved with this knowledge. I am skipping over a vast number of years. We are in 2020. What we also realized in the first few years of presenting this research, that people don't like being told bad news all the time. Simple fact of human, leadership. So with this information, our teams of our studios, this semester are in our 9th year of studio on this project. We started saying, okay, how do you create this change? So one of the projects early on became this idea that currently there is not a single pedestrian bridge on the Yamuna. Every single crossing between east and west, and obviously starting in the early 1970s, the east bank of the Yamuna has been very heavily developed. It's no longer the kind of flooding agricultural plain that the people who cross on a daily basis via metro or private vehicle or bus don't actually engage the river. So one of the first kind of river crossing master plans became this idea of these pedestrian avenues and these pedestrian bridges, which in the dry season may even allow you to interface with some of the floodplain. And so this, instead of being, this is all, by the way, the floodplain, in the white is the river, this is again the floodplain, that these would become, organic, biological, ecological preserves that would be accessible in the non-monsoon months as a kind of, urban amenity for the people of the city. And by that, we didn't mean amusement parks and roller coasters. We meant a kind of biological preserve, like a central park for the city. Partnering with the Delhi Jal Board, we looked very carefully at where, based on our work with them, they had decided to start to tap the Najafgarh Drain effluent. And so, in year 4 of our collaboration, Delhi Jal Board looked at what we were showing them and said, okay, let's start creating these sewage treatment plants along the drain. But I guess, many decades of culture or the way our government departments work, for them, the restoration of the Najafgarh drain meant putting these new sewage treatment plants everywhere. And what we started saying was that just putting the sewage treatment plants wouldn't be enough. Yes, it would tap the sewage, but with the enormous quantum of sewage flowing from stormwater drains that had become slums, anywhere you put a drain, you couldn't guarantee that that drain or the interceptor of the sewage would capture a future slum, or it would capture a future source of toxicity. So we started to share with them kind of paradigms for how this could be coupled with an urban rejuvenation mandate. So we took the time to really map very carefully where they were proposing major sewage treatment plants like the Coronation Park, Rithala, Keshopur, Niloti, Papan Kalan. But then we also looked at the minor ones. These are the smaller size. I mean, really nondescript, but where kind of localized sewage treatment could take place. So the entire Najafgarh drain spine could be treated like this. So we started preparing this drawing saying that we could work in 1 or 2 kilometer stretches, creating public amenity, public park space, and treating the entire spine, east-west spine of Najafgarh drain as a very large urban green space, but not in a cosmetic way. And I want to be very clear, this is not let's transform Delhi's nalas and make them green. That doesn't work. You would have to have urban mobility stitched alongside the banks. You would have to have the capacity for within the nala to act as a soak during the monsoon, because in the monsoon, these nalas would have up to 3 meters of water. You would have to have the capacity for all of the slum settlements to be rehoused in properly designed low-income housing around the nala. Otherwise, the incarnation of this clean vision would be ruined very quickly. So, and then more importantly, we started saying, okay, within the kind of 3-4 kilometer pedestrian walkability radius, what amenities would be made available to the people lowest on the economic spectrum? So would there be the government school? Would there be the free primary mohalla clinic? Would there be any work? Many of the people we spoke to in these slum settlements said, for them, the cost of a metro ticket is unaffordable. They cannot ride the metro. So then the idea that a bicycle path could allow you to traverse this 58-kilometer stretch and get to places of work in other sides. So we started really absorbing the inputs from citizens, often the most marginalized citizens in these areas, to create this kind of plan. So this was one of the drawings that was adopted by the Delhi Jal Board as a kind of vision drawing for what the Najafgarh could become. We stayed away from any kind of engagement on the commercial aspects of this development. And I think when you have a system of democracy where you're electing your leadership, then you also know that hand feeding or force feeding anything doesn't work. So you want to bring everyone to a consensus. You want to bring everyone to a point of awareness. But then you also realize that the actual aesthetics, the actual paradigms that get implemented may be quite different from what you are imagining in a utopian way. We took examples of, this is a photograph I took of one of those these are called sub drains. So these are drains that feed into slightly larger drains that then flow into the Najafgarh. In the dry season, there is absolutely no water. So 9-10 months of the year, these are absolutely dry. But what this does is that all of the surrounding areas dump their waste in them. And actually the municipal authorities are quite happy to let these be waste dumping grounds, because actually in Delhi, we don't have enough capacity now to absorb more solid waste. So we started, sort of analytically saying, okay, let's take the sub drain as a linear park in the dry season. Let's let it retain and absorb water during the wet season. And let's start to create kind of topographical and infrastructural drawings, say, where is a sidewalk like this that can be flooded in the monsoon? Where is a deck that can be dry? Where can the water be percolating? So we started actually doing, these are not really architectural projects in that sense, they are infrastructural projects, but they take this existing area where no one would need to be relocated, no one would need to be, rendered homeless. But you start to stitch together again the capacity of the city to harness and support ecology. This is one of those areas. This is the Vikaspur Drain, and we, in one of the studios, three of our students started to develop this project where just taking the derelict sites. So everything, there's a police housing colony which is right here in Vikaspuri. There's some other government LIG, DDA LIG flats here. So they just started taking all of this kind of derelict park area and the drain area and stitching it together in a kind of vision for an urban pedestrian spine that would then lead all the way to the major kind of corridor that would be created on the Najafgarh. Another project, and I know this is relevant to you because of your site, this is Central Vista, but about 4 or 5 years ago, before the whole kind of Central Vista controversy erupted, historically we found that the decision by Lutyens and Baker to rotate the axis of Rajpath perpendicular to the river this may be oversimplifying it, but it was essentially to avoid the vagaries of the monsoon flood. I mean, for 1,000 years, Delhi had lived and built parallel to the Yamuna. And so we realized that, well, now it's too late to rotate Central Vista, but surely it's not too late to rethink the Maidan in the center as something that could be perceived as an extension of the Yamuna floodplain. And so we worked with 2 or 3 of our design students to propose a kind of a set of wetland parks along the river, but then bring them into the city around Purana Killa, which actually used to have this very large physical moat, which, by the way, was not just a collector of monsoon water, but also did drain into the Yamuna. And we realized that maybe we can do that in a way that allows very free and well-designed pedestrian access to come past Pragati Maidan, the National Science Museum, the historic site of Purana Killa, past National Stadium, and that the reconnection to Rajpath is then again this re-awareness or this rekindling of the idea that these are not merely ornamental ponds, but there's a kind of aqueous link between the central axial spine of our city and the ecological manifestation of the Yamuna River. These are just some of the renderings and views that our studios would do to propose this kind of renewed relationship of ecology to the central axis spine. We looked very carefully at waste. One of the reasons why Delhi is out of capacity to absorb any more waste is because we don't segregate our waste. So in places like Japan or in South Korea or Switzerland, waste may be segregated into 17, 18, 23 different categories, and this is at the household level. So you would be responsible as an individual or as a family. Whereas in Delhi, at least for those of us who live in Delhi, we are seeing the failure of even our ability to segregate wet and dry waste. In fact, the waste collecting agency workers who come to collect what is now mandated as a separate bag for wet and a separate, by wet I mean organic waste and dry meaning non-organic waste. By the time they take the bags, they dump them into the same truck and it goes into the same landfill. So we've spent a lot of time. We had 4 or 5 set of concurrent students every year for 4 or 5 years, looking at how we could create a kind of waste sorting awareness, waste processing awareness, waste treatment plant awareness for the government. We've shared these ideas with the city. I'm going to go through a little bit quickly. I know we're running out of time. This is a project, a set of projects because of our work with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture on the museum, for the site museum for Humayun's tomb, which our office is doing in our private capacity, professional capacity as architects. A lot of our students started taking sites like Purana Killa on the left, which used to be Humayun's library. In fact, that's where he died, or Firoz Shah Kotla on the right in this view, which was really a seat of Muslim learning. And realize that instead of just treating them as archaeological artifacts, imperfectly preserved, that these needed to be restitched into the cultural fabric of the city. And whether this is a project by Joey Laughlin. He proposes a new national public library at Purana Killa. This is a project by Gabriel Rashley, who proposed a center for the study of Sufi music and literature at Firoz Shah Kotla. I mean, I think that we have to be much more open-minded that this history, if it is to survive, will need to coexist with contemporary programming and revitalization. We started looking at the big no-no, when we talk to people like Manoj Mishra and the Yamuna J Abhiyan, we realized that their positions are intractable. As much as we admire and support these visions of ecology, you cannot be, oblivious to the fact that 20 million or 24 million people living in the NCR region will have synergy with the river. There will be migrant workers there. There will be the lowest of the economic classes. But at every level, you cannot say the river will be pure, the river will be serene, but the human beings that need support in equal measure will be ignored. So we started looking at how this is a project by Eric Barr, where he looked at kind of water treatment infrastructure, but water treatment infrastructure that might be combined, with low income housing on the infrastructure itself. We've had a wonderful cadre of landscape architecture students who continue to work on this project. The University of Virginia has one of the top 10 landscape architecture degree programs in the US. And so we've had a lot of research locally, and we've collaborated on this with the team at the Yamuna Biodiversity Park to develop the kind of horticultural solutions that would do some level of peripheral or tertiary remediation on the floodplain. And this is a very important point, because I think if you really look at the quantum and the toxicity of the waste generated by Delhi and the citizens of Delhi, it is absolutely impossible to treat that waste purely biologically. So I want to make this point very clear that yes, you can definitely do peripheral and tertiary treatment and use organic and ecological means for that. But the primary treatment and the secondary treatment of black water will need to be an industrial process, at least with the current cost of the technology. We started looking at former parks. This is the Daryaganj Park, which used to be also a floodplain park, and realized that, for a lot of the infrastructure, you cannot just restore the parks to a park-like state. You need to actually also upgrade the architecture of the parks. This is a community center and social housing project done by a few of our students for the Daryaganj area. This is another social housing project also for the Daryaganj area. I mean, for these projects, we are proposing simply an FAR of 2. We are saying that it's perfectly feasible to create sustainable low-income housing with 4-story walk-ups in these neighborhoods, that the population does not need to be relocated. We are also carefully looking at the repurposing of this large existing infrastructure. So this is a proposal to convert one of the current bridges on the Yamuna to a pedestrian-only bridge, and that could support the kind of weekly or daily vegetable bazaar and garden. But it would start to create this more important role as the facilitator of pedestrian experience of the river on a daily basis. Inspired by the somewhat imperfect but well-meaning program of the Mohalla clinics that Delhi has started. This actually precedes the Mohalla clinic. This is in 2015 that several of our students, in meeting and talking to the people in many of the low-income neighborhoods, realized that there would have to be a program of public health facilities and hospitals at a smaller, primary level scale at many of these neighborhoods. We've got some proposals and sites where that is feasible. We looked at all of the crematoria. Traditionally, all the Hindu cremation grounds have been along the rivulets or the Yamuna itself, say the Nigam Bodh Ghat or the Lodi Road cremation ground. And those are not really places where, anywhere you're kind of grief-stricken when you're there, but they're really infrastructurally decrepit. And so many of the projects that our students started to look at were the upgradation of these to being kind of all gas, all electric crematoria with kind of pollution control filters, but also creating a better kind of environment for what is eventually an essential need for every single one of us. We looked at the last few surviving marshes in Delhi. This is the Jhangi Marsh, which is in North Delhi. At one point, this marsh was 70 square kilometers. Now it is less than 7 square kilometers, and actually much less, because of that 7 square kilometers, almost 50% was used as a dumping ground by the Delhi Metro during the construction of the Delhi Metro. So this is the Coronation Park sewage treatment plant. This is the Najafgarh drain coming in. So many of our landscape architecture students have been working consistently for the last 3-4 years on rewilding this marsh and making it again accessible with public points of interaction and entry, and then also using the gray water of the Coronation Park STP to actually to be treated through the marsh and then create this new kind of water body within the marsh. Again, like I said, we continue to publish our work actively. We continue to put it in the public domain. We've had several exhibits, and I have a pretty relentless schedule of lectures I give on this project. This was an exhibit we did for the people of Delhi at the India Habitat Center for about 3 weeks in 2017. Absolutely free, absolutely open to the public. And again, we continue to engage in dialogue with absolutely anyone who's willing to speak to us. So with that, I will stop. I hope I have a few minutes for questions, and I'm happy to do that.
Thank you so much, Pankaj. That was, I have to say, I've heard this presentation before, and every time it's a shock. Every time there's some revelation of a kind, and also realizations that that there are possibilities, there is hope, there is the possibility of change, and some things which are also very interesting. I mean, conversations between the government departments of the governance structure under which the Yamuna falls. All that is the kind of stories that could be built around these, which have real possibilities of engagement in different ways that you've already kind of taken up by your own studio and your students who have been working on it for 9 years, you said.
Yes,
which is itself incredible.
I think I should just clarify that every year the cadre of students is new. So this is the 9th year, but every single year the actual students who participate is a totally different group of students.
Yeah. No, also I think there is for our own participants of the studio, there is the kind of understanding that empirical methods must be in some ways dovetailed and married with creative engagements and more imaginative engagements. I think that's a great understanding and learning from this morning's talk. Also, I thought that one of the very important things that you mentioned was this idea of a cultural insemination back into our spaces, and the sense of the sacred returning to some of these spaces of the river and of the commons. I think that's something that we all need to look at. And I guess I'll leave it to the other panelists, but our only hope is that through our own work, we can extend your very admirable and essential program of awareness that you've begun.
I'm happy to answer any questions or anything that anyone, students, faculty, anyone.
I just wanted to
absolutely wanted to go ahead.
Go ahead, Riaz.
No, I just wanted to thank Pankaj for this and the absolutely wonderful presentation. Together, many strands of
Yes, we can't hear you.
thought. Oh, okay. I'm just sorry. Sarosh, if you want to continue, I'll come later once I get sound.
It's quite likely that I might be repeating what Riaz is saying anyways. I was absolutely blown away. I've seen this for the first time in the kind of total breadth through which you presented it. What struck me the most is really the entanglements of things that come through in the project. That you start with what is essentially the Najafgarh Drain, and a problem of sewage, but then it slowly expands into this. And I was just like, wow, at what point is it going to stop? And it really just consumes all of Delhi, as it should, as a very, very convincing meta narrative of how through waste one needs to transform literally everything. And it goes all the way up to the mohalla school and the bazaar and temporal thinking. And so what strikes me is really the entanglements of things. And it also strikes me, and I was sort of chatting about this with Riaz actually, that you're an architect. You're not a landscape architect. So it really gives me a lot of hope in our profession somehow, because it feels like we need architects. We are somehow the last of the generalist professions who can make the connections between empirical thinking, cultural ways of considering life, ecological thinking. And I don't really have a question. I just want to say I'm really, really, really happy to see this. And I wonder if you were, if waste was like the generator the whole time, or you somehow it was the kind of obvious takeoff, because it seems like waste becomes the trigger for everything that follows.
Thank you, Sarosh. I'm glad you asked the question. Actually, I'm sorry I didn't clarify. We didn't start actually with the Vikaspur Drain. It's really interesting. The first 2 years, we were so kind of skittish about our own capacity and capability that we just took literally 2 defining architectural landmarks. We took Shah Jahanabad, we took the Red Fort, and we took Humayun's tomb. So we said, let's just take, and they're exactly 6 kilometers apart on the Yamuna as the crow flies, or as the boat rows. So we decided to literally just spend the first 2 years only looking at the Yamuna between the Red Fort and Humayun's tomb. And I think, as they say in politics, if you want to solve a conundrum, just follow the money. I think we realized very quickly in this project that if you really, as you looked between the waters of the Red Fort and the Yamuna, you just followed the stench. And so the stench led us to the Vikaspur Drain, and the stench led us to the Bhalswa landfill. And really, I think I'm very grateful for the plurality of thinking that my architectural education at both University of Virginia and at Yale engendered, because what it did was it didn't make me fearful of my lack of training as a landscape architect. I have no degree in planning. My only degrees are in architecture. But those are degrees in thought, in the capacity to assimilate complex urban predicaments into a cohesive narrative that can at best be represented for conjecture or debate. The other thing I want to say here is this is, when people say, wow, this is really amazing research, blah, 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 I never think of it that way. I think it's simply like airing your quilt in the winter, right? You take it out in the summer, in the sun, and then you air it out. All of the information that we are presenting has always been in the public domain. This is the kind of real sort of shocker. We found connections between things, but those things existed in the public domain. I think what was flabbergasting was the lack of interest in those things, the lack of curiosity in stitching them together. And the final piece I'll just add here is this project will never be finished. This project will go on as long as the city exists, because the day you stop thinking of these relationships is the day your city starts to atrophy, which is what has happened. In and around 1965, 1970, we stopped thinking of our city as an evolving paradigm which would need future proofing or kind of ecological harnessing in some way. Tethering is a word I use. And I think all we are realizing is, while people are shocked, I'm very grateful to my university for supporting this for 9 years and counting. But actually, what it's made me realize is that this generation of 60 or 50 students who are taking the studio need to pick up the mantle now, because this conversation is going to be essential for the next 5 decades.
Can I ask, when you present this to people in the city, do you run into a lot of how will we fund this and where will the money come from? And because you skirt, like you said very clearly, you're not interested in the sort of commercial viability of things because the agenda is to present the situation as it is. So I'm curious about. But you also mentioned that there were people from the business school that you were working with. So I'm curious about the viability conversations with the city.
So actually, there are two reasons I should clarify. One, the University of Virginia is a non-profit public university in the US. So we as a university are not allowed to engage in any commercial exchange. So all our work here is funded entirely by the university or grants that the university secures. That's one. And two, the university believes that projects like these need to have a complete firewall between the kind of generator of policy or idea-based narratives and the implementers. We cannot also be the contractors, for instance. That said, what was really shocking, Sarosh, is that every single person we presented to, from the water ministers, and we presented now to 3 water ministers, the LG of Delhi, the chief minister of Delhi, money has never been an issue. In fact, we were told that the coffer, I mean, admittedly, my last pre-pandemic meeting was in March. Since then, I've had 1 or 2 more with the Delhi water minister now. But even the last meeting, which took place 2 weeks ago with Mr. Jain in Delhi, who's the current water minister, they have the money. The financial resources are there. It's literally just a question of governance oversight. It's a question of cross delineating, like who can do what. Can the DDA actually be made to do something that the Jal board wants them to do? And really showing them the benefit of something that may accrue after their political term is over. That's the biggest challenge. It's not the money, but it's the fact that I won't be water minister in 4 years. So if your project is not going to be tangible and conclusive in 3.5 years, then I'm not going to be interested in doing it. So this is actually the biggest learning, is that no one in governance, no one in politics wants the fruit of their labor to be reaped and celebrated by their successor. I don't want to be pessimistic. All we did was then we started putting projects in 2 and 3 year timeframes. So, which is totally possible, actually. Any other questions? Any other comments? Yes.
Yes, Professor Vasavra, you're on mute though.
No, I mean, this is absolutely commendable. And I think it's a pity that, we are ignorant about this. It's a pity for us. And, because I think we also live on a city with river. And this river also has a history. But that is apart. What I'm really fascinated with is the continuity with which you have looked at the river and the support from the university, and also the successive groups of students, who have really continued in a direction which you have proposed. So this is something, which is very impressive. Second thing is, as you said, as an architect, I think you were the lead. But the fact that you have exploited your capacities to collaborate with people and establish and keep the vision, which is something, which you have conceived, is really commendable.
Thank you.
So, no, I mean, this is from my heart, I'm telling you. And the other thing is, don't you think, out of your experience of all these, dealing with the governments and different agencies, don't you feel that there is a need for cities to have independent structures which may have linkages with the successive government, but in order to sort of, pursue these kind of works, which are essentially public welfare, there has to be a kind of continuum with these kind of bodies, with their own independent authority to pursue this. Because this is not there with us, you see, and that's why every time a government changes, the projects and their directions change, or they are simply aborted, or, it simply doesn't have any continuity. So don't you think there has to be also a kind of suggestion for this kind of, management of these kind of projects, which is actually done by authorities, which are independent of this political power?
I think that I have I have a slightly now, after all these years, a more nuanced view of that. I totally agree. I think there are gross inefficiencies with our current governance system. There is no question about that. And for instance, even 3 years into our collaboration with the Delhi Jal Board, this really visionary CEO, IAS officer, Keshav Chandra, was basically kicked out of his position as CEO of Jal Board and moved to the Commerce Ministry. And his successor had absolutely no interest in collaborating with us. In fact, to the point, he didn't even want to have a single meeting with the university. Now, we just swallow our pride and we keep marching on. So, while that was happening, we looked for other allies. We found an ally in the government of Rajasthan who said, listen, I want to take the lessons of your work on the Yamuna and bring it to Jaipur and see what we can do here. We started getting calls from the mayor of Buenos Aires or the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, who had seen one of our presentations, and she said, can you help us with Dhaka? We ended up advising a World Bank committee that is now working on a water river restoration system for Dhaka. So I think, first of all, I want to step back and say that the rewards or the successes, if you can I use that word very carefully, are maybe not manifest in Delhi particularly, perhaps. I think, with all that said, that I think it's very important that the tenets of our representatives, the democratic representatives we elect, need somehow to have a kind of authority over what we do, as ill-conceived as some of those tenets may be. I'm saying this because we have also seen that there have been some, positions or episodes in Delhi's history, I'm sure in Ahmedabad and others, where that level of power or authority, when wielded incorrectly, can also cause catastrophic damage. And so I'm very careful now. I would love for there to be a Yamuna River Commission headed by an enlightened Yamuna River Commissioner who takes everything and says, okay, for the next 10, 15, 20 years, here's what we're doing. But I shudder to think that in the wrong hands, that same office might be, in gross violation of certain, environmental, ecological, civic, social norms. So I actually have begun slowly to think that, yes, there is huge opportunity to reform the present structure. There needs to be a more accountable delivery mechanism and a delivery system. But it also comes down to our citizenry being more aware of these issues, because the minute our citizens are more aware, they will vote people into office with an understanding of those issues. That's the hope. I mean, I spent 6 or 7 months going to Batla House, and most people know of Batla House as this neighborhood in Delhi where terrorists were shot. But this is essentially an urban Muslim ghetto where the population, ranges from CEOs of companies to faculty of universities to, leather tanners. But they are all of one religious denomination. They are so marginalized and so disempowered that they dare not articulate their vision for that site. So I also feel that we have another role, which is to be the conscience keepers, to speak truth to power without being interested in that power. And I think that is actually, for me now, an essential tenet of my role as an academic, as a researcher, and perhaps even as a practitioner or a director of this project.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that satisfies or answers your question. But
No. I mean, this is something, which is absolutely to the point.
Yeah.
But I only wish you a great success in doing this, because I think then this can become a real great example of how to deal, with cities and its ecology.
Right.
And I think in that sense, I think your work is extremely a pointer to the group which is now working on Central Vista.
Sorry, finish.
Sorry.
Please finish.
No, what I was saying was that your work is really extremely useful and exemplary for the Central Vista project and those who are guiding the studio, because I think the way you have articulated the multidisciplinary approach, to sort of conceive a kind of strategy for complete, sort of a holistic thinking is something, which will really help ultimately. And I think those who are in charge of the studio can really have a lot of inspiration from this. This is what I really feel. So in that sense, this is very useful.
I want
But
to say
we always, I'm sorry. No, I'm
No,
sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I want to say one thing here, though, and I really think this is a very important lesson for the students and the leaders of this particular Central Vista studio. I think you must be very clear-eyed and honest about what you find on the ground, even when what you find on the ground goes against very loudly stated conventional wisdom. I'll give you an example. There is an authority or in the government who manages all kind of quasi-government water-related issues in Delhi, named, well, actually, maybe I shouldn't name him. This professor, formerly of IIT, heads every major committee for the Green Tribunal on the Yamuna and everything. He was single-handedly responsible for the creation of the Yamuna Biodiversity Park. Now, I have made probably 50 visits to that park, 14 of them with my students. Every single time my students and I would go to the Yamuna Biodiversity Park, we would never see more than 2 or 3 individuals in that park. And if you know if you look at Google Earth and you look at where the Yamuna Biodiversity Park is, it is surrounded by a belt of slums and very high density, low income settlements. There is no entry ticket to go to the park, it's free. So when we asked this founder, how come there are no citizens in this park? Where are the people? They are literally across from the barbed wire fence on top of that brick boundary wall. And he said to us, this park is not for the people, it's for scientists. It's for us to study what happens, how you clean water, a leopard came. And that was shocking that this hero, this person whose virtues are extolled by the government as, because for me, that park is an abject failure. Yes, it may have some clean water, but so does the Prime Minister's tap on Racecourse Road. That doesn't, its relationship to the public domain, to an egalitarian sense of the polity, to citizens in our republic is non-existent. So I actually say that, for the students who are participating in this, be really careful, be very wary of these so-called kind of success stories, because if you don't ask the second and the third round of probing questions, then you are likely to come away with the false narratives that often decimate the capacity of our city to be intelligently evolving.
Mm-hmm. No, that is true. I mean, what you're saying is perfectly true, because I think this is also a great danger in what is proposed for Central Vista. Because that also might become something, which is totally anti-people, although, I mean, they are calling it a kind of democratic institution.
Yeah.
But this is something, which is going to be the result, So what you're saying is absolutely true. And this is what is the great lesson from what you are doing, you see, because I think for you, people are never out of sight at whatever level you are looking at it.
They are the reason. They are the reason to do.
Yeah, absolutely. They are never out of sight. So
and
this is something
which between is people and ecology.
Absolutely. I mean, and I don't think anything can exist without that.
Yeah.
You see, because it only becomes a kind of falsified, museum.
Yeah.
No, this is great. I'm very impressed.
I mean, I'm not making a plug for this, but this is the Yamuna River Project book. Unfortunately, we could not find a publisher in India, so it's been published in the US and in Europe. But if anyone wants copies, if Shudipto can make a list, I can arrange for copies to be mailed out. But one of the interesting things was exactly this, that this relationship of understanding the dilemma, presenting a solution, but not giving that solution of a definitive form was something that Iñaki and I do very carefully. Like in none of our propositions are we saying something should look this way or should use material or be the scale, because that's what architects do. And I think I want to be very clear that our role in this project is not to be an architect. It is actually to think like an architect, to set the stage for other architects in the future, but not ourselves to be prescribing, yeah, I should stop there.
No, I think that is fantastic, you see, because I think building eventually becomes the result of all this, you see, because what really precedes the whole act of building is all these sensibilities, out of which you somehow see that the building is really an integrated part of the entire ecology, and it doesn't come first.
Yeah, sure.
No, this is true. I mean, I would be certainly interested in the book, and I'll contact you later.
Please.
Thank
Pankaj,
you.
we have several students who wanted to ask you questions, but I have here somebody who wanted to speak with you. So I'll
How
just.
are you?
Pankaj, right now I'm a trespasser, because of Sudipta, I'm able to come and talk to you, but your presentation was amazing, absolutely wonderful. But it was also for me personally, it's so moving because can you believe that I had the opportunity to swim in Yamuna?
Yeah.
We used to boat in the Yamuna. And now when I see your studies and your very, very hard work, I was wondering what is going to happen finally, because your study of, it seems here I can see the main villain is the Najafgarh Nala, just one of the, and there are so many other nalas which end up in Najafgarh Nala. Now, all along this, the developments that we see in all the areas, whether you begin with from Ayanagar to whether you go towards, in these outskirts of Saket, all these so-called villages which support the posh colonies, the requirement is continuously increasing. For example, say about 10 years back, the FAR of Saket was doubled up. Moment the population of Saket increases, the villages have to also increase the number of people who support Saket per se. So if you try to solve, now supposing you have solved a problem of one of the nalas which have got the 2-story houses on one side, and you've been able to solve the solid waste and you've been able to revive certain things, by the time you have implemented, the 2 stories have become 4 stories and you seem as if you have been caught up by something else. It's almost like the Einstein race. So my question was, of course, you have given me the answer already in some other form, that do you think there is an answer, or this scary or very exhaustive, fantastic report that you have produced is going to help other cities like Dhaka, maybe Jaipur, maybe other coming, unless and until we have a pandemic. Because pandemic here, I see Delhi is slightly stalled. You can still kind of drive on the roads, but this is not going to happen very long unless we change our method of working and whether it's going to work at all. I was thinking if, for example, the whole of Central Vista, the government offices shifted to where the new international airport was making, say somewhere in Java, so that they had a new Delhi. Like Germany's capital is a very small city, right? I mean, you go to Frankfurt, you go to Cologne, you go to Hanover, but the capital is somewhere which is, I think the capital is Bonn, which is a very small city. Now, why should Delhi have the capital here where you have got business, you have got professionals, and the government, if you can shift, but of course, they are so much in love with this Latins Delhi, so much in love with Rashtrapati Bhavan, they can't leave. Rashtrapati Bhavan should be a museum. It is not meant for Rashtrapati, frankly. But anyway, so my question was, you think you have a solution? Your studies are absolutely fantastic and to the point, but by the time there is somebody, first of all, you have to motivate some IS officer and a good one will be shifted. It's very few like S.K. Sharma who could in 5 years create the cultural hub of Delhi. And there are very few who can really, it has to be, unless it is autocratic and it is done like Brasilia was done, created in, they had to flood all the slums to be able to create Brasilia. So you think there is a solution to what you're suggesting, unless your studies are going to certainly be extremely helpful to all the other, maybe other countries, other cities. But do you think Delhi will be able to resolve its problem?
So thank you for your comments, Uncle. I think I don't have I wouldn't call it a solution, but I think we definitely have a conclusion, and that conclusion is inescapable. Actually, you cannot have a city of 20 million where 8.5 million people live in slums. That is not a city. And so I think if there is a conclusion, it's that the first priority for us all as members of the community that plans, that designs, that implements, that thinks our way out of dilemmas has to be front and center the placement of service for the lowest on this economic scale. We cannot escape this conclusion that before we make another airport, and I'm not a Luddite. I don't say, okay, stop making technology before you give everyone a charkha. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that the conclusion that is inescapable is that unless we embark on a really thoughtful, serious, ecological program of low income housing embedded absolutely inextricably within the fabric of urban Delhi, we will not be able to create a city with an ecology that can be sustained, and we will not be able to create a city in which livability standards will ever surpass the kind of mediocre quality at which they exist now. So I think I'll leave it at that, but I think that you cannot entrust the construction of large-scale low-income housing to the NBCC or to the DDA. This will have to be a local effort. It will have to be in every single little district. Every MLA elected to the Delhi Assembly should be given the authority and the funding and the technical support to create housing capacity for every single member of the below poverty line group that lives in that. I mean, I think I'm very clear that any solution will have to marry democratic process with architectural and urban technical prowess. It cannot be disengaged, and it cannot be unilateral. It cannot be centrally mandated. It will have to be literally, we'll have to go to Saket, talk to the Saket MLA and say, okay, you currently have 58,000 people living in slums. We need to design housing for 100,000 people for low income housing. Because the hope is actually, and that's the conclusion that, and we've seen this because we've studied a lot of cities, if that is done well, then in the next 15 years, you should see that very domicile change its economic status to the lower middle class. We have seen this, we have evidence of this. So I will stop there. But other questions?
Am I audible, Pankaj?
Yes, Riaz, I can.
Riaz. I'm just going to, okay, so this was back. So I was just waiting for him. So maybe he can take up some of the questions or invite the participants who had questions to ask.
So we have Priya and Kush and Divyashri who had posted questions. I've brought them onto the panel. If you can unmute yourselves one by one and ask your question, please.
Yeah, hi, this is Priya here. See, thanks for the wonderful presentation. First of all, Mr. Pankaj. My observation across cities in India, working here for a couple of decades, has been like, any change needs to be done in a policy level and an organizational level and an individual level, And your entire study has brought in a level of awareness from the common man to the highest level of governance. And you also cited examples from Japan, from other countries where waste has been segregated into 15 different types, 17 different types. But we also have, in that same light, shining examples in India where Indore is doing waste segregation till the last iota. Policy level decisions in Bangalore and Kerala are like waste segregation is mandatory. So where my question lies is like, with all the clout and the reach that your program has, is it really not possible to get into a policy level change, at least on these grounds, as waste segregation is compulsory in Delhi, recycling is compulsory in Delhi, these would be the ground up approach where things would start, right?
So I should disabuse you of any notions. We enjoy no clout in Delhi. We have no connections with government, actually, to be very honest. And really, it's been the merit of the work or the ability of our university to support the dissemination of the work, where these phone calls or emails come saying, "Can you meet? Can you present?" etc. So I should just say that clearly. We are not in any way a government supported or mandated agency. I think the second thing is, it's a mixed bag. I mean, I have sat with municipal commissioners in the MCD in Delhi who say, who are you to tell us that our waste segregation should be mandated? We generate 1/5 the waste per individual than, say, a person in the US. So, it's sometimes, these conversations are also sometimes very testy, and they can be quite aggressive, where nobody in those very short-term positions of power wants to be criticized for something that they don't want to take responsibility for, and b promise a solution. So I think there are definitely many success stories across our country. There's no denying that. I think the dilemma is that you can have a successful waste segregation program in Bangalore, and you can still have filthy groundwater. You can have a really amazing kind of commissioner take charge in Indore, and 5 or 6 years later find that those efforts have gone to dot. I think all we are trying to say is that the plurality or the multidisciplinarity of these approaches has to be really embedded in the ethos of what it means for you and I to feel like citizens of a place. Only when we understand and accept these roles and responsibilities, then we transfer those roles to our elected representatives and give them clear mandates. I'm Saurabh Bhardwaj, I'm electing you as my MLA, and these are a collective list of 5 or 6 priorities. So I know it's very slow. There's no magic bullet. I mean, and I'm glad we don't have a quote unquote riverfront in Delhi yet, and I hope we never do. Because I think if you do what I'm saying, what we are finding, if you engage in this plurality, A, it will never be finished, it will always evolve, and B, it will be sometimes quite antithetical or quite messy. It won't be such a neat and clean and codified solution that might visually create a certain iconography. It may actually demand, a whole range of possibilities. That's what I would say.
Yeah, also to engage like Buckingham Canal in Chennai, or all these 5 canals which are there in Kochi, or then all of them are, India as a city, as a country, has a similar set of issues reoccurring time and again with the various rivers and the various canals in various cities, right? It's not like only in Delhi. So once a set of these basic parameters get set, that these are the minimums every city needs to do, at least we move an inch closer to the real or utopian optimistic goal. Maybe that's where I was hoping to.
Sure. No, I agree. And I think that's why it's really important to keep demonstrating the research in a public way, to keep talking about it, to try and get smaller success stories going where possible. I think it'll be very slow but steady march, actually. It's a march.
Sorry, we have taken almost 2 hours of your time. So, I mean, can I request the others to be really quick with your questions and keep them succinct, please?
Yeah, Sudipto, I'll go for the next question. Hi, Professor. Thank you for the beautiful, breathtaking imagery and sharing your work. So my question is basically Delhi. I also lived in Delhi for a few years, and I look at Delhi as a very exploitative, parasitical city. It kind of depends on all the NCR, the entire NCR area heavily for dumping its waste, for extracting resources. And in a way, we do not hold Delhi accountable enough for what it does. So even for the landfills that you mentioned, Balswa and Ghazipur, all of these landfills are outside of the city, and this everything, the toxic waste, it seeps down into this NCR area and affects the people who live around this area and not Delhi itself. While it is Delhi that should be bearing the weight of what it does, the consequences of the waste it produces, but we do not see that happening. So how do we make sure, even in the presentation that we shared, we did not talk about how the brunt of all of this is borne by areas around. So how do we make sure the areas around Delhi, which is Haryana and UP, do not pay for Delhi's gluttony? And this has been, I know this has been there for centuries. Delhi has been living off of resources from areas around. But how do we make sure that does not continue to happen and Delhi takes accountability of what it does to the areas around? Why do we let Delhi to be this spoiled child?
I'm sorry, I don't agree entirely with what you're saying at all, because if you were to really go and spend time in the areas of Delhi where we've marched up and down for the last 8 or 9 years, you will very clearly see that there's a huge consequence and a huge brunt that is being borne by the citizens of Delhi. That actually it is the poorest of the poor, and at least 8 or 10 million of those, if not everybody else, who is already tasting toxic waters, who's already breathing septic air, who is already living on detritus of trash generated within the city. So, it's interesting if you look at the historic literature that exists. I mean, for instance, when the British created the administrative structure of Kanpur, they couldn't find any of their officers willing to go and administer Kanpur, because the way they set up Kanpur, for instance, in UP, was as not as an urban metropolis, which it used to be. It was as a resource extraction from the tanneries. So it was made clear that this was not supposed to be, in their imagination, the continuation of the historic city of Kanpur. It was a city that would treat leather, it would generate effluent and throw all that into the river. I think there is not, I mean, in my travels across India, I have not found a place that doesn't do the same, which is not an excuse. And I don't think it's entirely fair, because to say that, everyone passes the buck to the person further down. I think there is definitely a buck being passed. But if you ask me, as a citizen of Delhi, do I want my water to be clean and my trash to be disposed of and then, shipped downstream? No. The Yamuna doesn't become clean when it leaves Delhi until the Betwa and the Ken and other tributaries from the Madhya Pradesh, from the Chambal, come and bring fresh water into it, right? So I think all I'm saying is that what we are trying to pioneer using Delhi as a case study will need to be done by Sonipat. It will need implementation in Gurgaon, in Haryana. It will need Bulandshahr, it will need Meerut, it will need Aligarh, it will need Kanpur, it will need Lucknow. So I don't think this is a case where I disagree with this. I don't think this is a case where you can be provincial or you can start apportioning blame. I think this is a collective consciousness saying methodological paradigms need to be implemented nationwide. They need to start at the smallest scale, they need to start at mega city scale, and they need to all harness and harmonize the minimum level of processing standards, utility standards, infrastructural provisions for every single citizen. I think this is the relationship between the governed and the democratic citizenry. This is that kind of political equation. I demand the right to breathe clean air just as much as the citizen of Ladakh and the citizen of Meerut. I demand the right to clean water as much as any other person in any other place of my country.
Thanks, Pankaj. One last question, if you can.
Sure.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
Hey, Pankaj. Hi. Hey, Mr. Gupta. Thank you for the presentation. I hope you're well. I'll try to keep my question fairly short, and I'm sure the answer may not be as easy, but you were describing how the 100-year problem has now become like a 25-year problem. So the problem is imminent of flooding. How has your studio, or have you personally explored potential solutions for like how you would deal with the impact of that? Like, is evacuating people out of the floodplain region the only solution? Or, as you said, since building walls isn't a solution, what would how would you go about conceiving a solution to this problem?
I think that this is actually a simple question to answer. The conclusions on this are clear, that you have to give the river room to flood. It needs room to flood. And that room to flood is not necessarily because of the current wisdom, which is, we'll control the flow of water upstream, or we'll close that barrage and we'll let Yamuna Nagar flood and save Delhi. That's not because in climate change, as you know, you can have a kind of torrential downpour, and you can get 50 or 80 or 100 millimeters of rain falling in a 24-hour period. And in those freak times, no amount of precautionary measure taken upstream will help. So what we have said clearly is that you have to start a program of disengagement of the floodplain. You have to take places where it's the lowest hanging fruit, like the bus depot or the waste processing plant or the derelict fly ash dumping ground, and first restore those as soaks. And then you move outwards from that. And I think I'm reiterating this at the risk of sounding repetitive. You really need to rethink the strategy of your housing. I mean, the fact that whether it's the Commonwealth Games Village or it's the Akshardham Temple, these should never have been built on the floodplain, but now they are built. So what are you going to do? You're going to try and mitigate those consequences by saying, okay, where can we offer amenities or alternatives that allow those basic, and these are hydrology experts can be very precise in saying, okay, here's where that flooding will happen. So maybe instead of 3 million people being inundated, you protect 2 million and you say, okay, these 2 million people will be largely safe. This 1 million person population will need temporary evacuation. But I think it will be incremental. These solutions will need to be incremental. There will never be a magic bullet or all-encompassing answer.
Thank you so much, Pankaj. We've taken a lot of your time. You've left us with a lot of things to think about. And thank you also for answering so comprehensively all the concerns and questions.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.